This lecture is organized by the Student Coalition Berlin, and we are a Berlin-wide collective of students from all different disciplines representing 10 different Berlin-based universities who were both deeply concerned with the unfolding events in Palestine and Israel, as well as the repression and silencing surrounding ongoing discourses and knowledge production about these events in Germany. Over the last 8 months of escalating genocide, our coalition has been organizing in a wide variety of ways, from sit-ins, die-ins, and demos to occupations and encampments, with the goal of pressuring our universities to uphold their values of academic freedom and integrity. And we've also organized a now 17-part lecture discussion and screening series to create these spaces of free academic discourse that are no longer present in our universities. So today, for our latest conversation in this series, we are incredibly lucky and honored to be joined by Dr. Ghada Karmi, who is a renowned Palestinian doctor, activist, academic, and writer. Her books include her best-selling memoir, which many of you I'm sure know, In Search of Fatima, as well as her latest book, One State, The Only Democratic Future for Palestine-Israel, published in 2023. Dr. Karmi was born in Jerusalem and was forced to leave her home as a child with her family as a result of the Nakba in 1948. She's lived for several decades in the UK, where she trained as a doctor of medicine at Bristol University, and she established the first British-Palestinian medical charity in 1972 and was an associate fellow at the Royal Institute for International Affairs and a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Her life story and contributions are so incredibly rich and varied that it's difficult to include them all in a short introduction. So we're so honored to get to be in conversation with you. Dr. Ghada, thank you for being here. I wanted to start our conversation in 1948 when you were a young child. I think you were 8, and you were living in Jerusalem as the Nakba unfolded around you. Could you describe for us the atmosphere in Jerusalem as the Nakba began ramping up, and how it unfolded for you and your family? And then in particular, what was the tipping point or event that led to the moment of rupture and the broad expulsion of Palestinians?
Well, look, first thing to say is Jerusalem at the time had become increasingly troubled. There were many violent incidents because what was happening was that the Jewish militias, because these weren't Israelis at the time, this was before the state was established, these Jewish militias were very focused on 2 things. Number 1, getting the British to leave, and number 2, getting the Palestinian indigenous population to leave. So they engaged in a campaign of bombing, shooting, terrorism in order to get the British to go, and also to terrorize the Palestinians into fleeing. And one can understand that at the time, what did that mean to people? Well, it meant that they, as they believed it, that they would evacuate their families if they could, and take them to somewhere which was safer than Jerusalem was at the time, and wait a bit for, quote, things to settle down, unquote. So that's what was going on for the Palestinians. The British, of course, were a very different story. They knew very well that the Jewish soldiers and the Jewish agency, the leadership of the Jews in Palestine was about to establish the state of Israel. They knew that, and they knew they would be leaving. So they would leave Palestine to them. For me as a child, of course, not understanding any of this, what I felt was that it was, things weren't normal. You know, it's very difficult as a child to actually understand what was going on. All I knew was nothing was normal. School was closed. All my friends had disappeared. Many families in our neighborhood had already left their homes, evacuated. And we were among the few who were left still hanging on to our home. So I can only describe to you an atmosphere of increasing violence outside around us and consequent terror on the part of my parents, and of course for us children who did not understand it but could see that our parents were scared and things weren't normal. And so that's how it felt. Now, the immediate spur to us leaving was really the Deir Yassin massacre, which took place on April the 9th, 1948. Deir Yassin was a village close to Jerusalem, which actually, ironically enough, had got an agreement with the Zionist militias that they would not resist and would be left alone. And that was the agreement. But on April the 10th, Zionist gangs, under the leadership, as it happens, of one Menachem Begin, who became Prime Minister of Israel sometime later. Anyway, they invaded Deir Yassin, dragged the men out, shot them dead, and killed others as well, women. It was so terrifying for the villagers that, of course, they could do nothing but either flee or stay behind to mourn and bury their dead. But the important thing about Deir Yassin was that the Zionists went out in jeeps all through Jerusalem streets saying, well, you know what happened at Deir Yassin? You're next. So, that frightened a lot of people and led them to leave. And our family was part of that. So we left very much with the idea in my parents' minds that it would be temporary, it would be for a short while until things calmed down, and then we'd all be back. So that's how it was at the time that we left in April 1948.
When did it become clear that you couldn't come back?
I would say not for several years, not for several years. So people, really, the history of 1948, the way it's told, the way people understand it, is somehow mechanistic, somehow it lacks imagination. There was this is what you read or what you're told. The native population fled because of war, and that was the end of that. But of course, it wasn't like that. So people left very much with the idea that they were coming home. And in our case, even when we had taken refuge in England, as is my family, that's what happened with my family, my parents still spoke of their belief that this would be temporary. It really, and I can remember as a child, my mother saying, when we went to other friends' houses and we saw that they had central heating and refrigerators and things, and we'd come home and say to my mother, look, why can't we have a fridge? And why can't we have this or that? And my mother would say, we're not staying. That's why we're not having those things, because we're not staying. And that was the sentiment with which I grew up.
I also wondered about how experiencing the Nakba then, but I guess, of course, besides forcing you out of Palestine, but how that experience as a young child informed your life's work as an activist and scholar and physician.
Well, I have to tell you, not immediately, not at all, because you see, I suppose, like all refugees or people who've had to been forced out of their homes, the shock and the trauma of all of that and trying to adjust to a new society took up all one's energies. And if you actually think, I, as a child, knew no English at all, not a word. And my mother didn't, and my brother didn't. Only my father and the eldest of us, my sister, because she'd learned it at school, but my father worked with the mandate authorities in Palestine, so he knew English very well, but we didn't. And so imagine what it would have taken to for me as a child going to a primary school, unable to speak the language, completely terrified of very different surroundings. The surroundings in England, London, were nothing whatsoever like my homeland. Nothing. It was not only thousands of miles away, but it was years away in terms of the way society functioned. So I explain it by saying that all of us were busy trying to adjust. Because remember, we hadn't gone to another Arab country, like many Palestinians did, where the cultural differences were not pronounced. We had gone to a Western country where everything was completely different. So I would say to you that many years were spent, certainly by me, maybe not my parents, but us children, trying to make our way in the new society. And that took up all one's energies, and you didn't sit around thinking, oh, why are we here and what's happening back in the home country? And no, we didn't. Now, I became an activist only really after the 1967 war, the so-called Six-Day War, Arab-Israeli War, where Israel was able to occupy the rest of Palestine, and where, the Arab states were defeated by Israel, very soundly defeated. It was extremely depressing and really very depressing for Arabs. It's a terrible time. And it was then only really that I began to think, began to ask a question: who am I? You see, remember that what I was trying to do was to fit in. So I'm trying to blur differences between me and the people around me. And I thought I'd succeeded quite well. I was very anglicized, spoke English very well indeed, and felt myself somehow to be English. And then when the 67 war happened, it was obvious that all the friends I had, all the people I knew were on Israel's side, and nobody was on our side, on the Arab side. And that was a rude shock. I remember thinking, hang on, who am I? Actually, who am I? I'm not English, therefore I must be Arab. And what does that mean? And then started a journey of rediscovering my own identity. And that also took a while before I became an activist in the 1970s.
Kind of still on this topic of Palestinian activism and organizing in diaspora, one of President Eisenhower's assumptions following the first Nakba was that the problem of Palestine, quote unquote, would resolve itself within a generation. He believed that as Palestinians dispersed globally and new generations were born outside of Palestine, these new generations would become more attached to their new countries, more assimilated, and the aspiration for a nation state would eventually fade away. But of course, history has shown a totally different outcome for the Palestinians, who, instead of abandoning their aspiration to return, has only strengthened. And this resilience it's stunning in many ways, particularly today, as in the face of escalating genocide, the global movement for Palestinian liberation is stronger and more interconnected than ever. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who was part of the earliest generation of Palestinian activists in the West, could you explain this phenomena? How have Palestinians organized themselves so successfully in exile, and has it felt that way?
Well, remember that by the 1970s, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, had been established and was fully functional by the early 1970s. And that was enormously important in the life of Palestinians in the diaspora because the PLO was a diaspora organization. It arose amongst Palestinians in exile outside Palestine, and it quickly organized a movement which uh, presented itself as a representative body for the Palestinian people, wherever they were. And it was highly successful at the beginning, very effective. And, you know, for people who actually don't know this, I can only assure you that for us in exile, adrift from our homeland, the PLO was Palestine. It became a substitute for the homeland. We uh, supported it. We approved of it. Many of us paid to support it. It made us proud to be Palestinian. We had not been killed off by the Israelis after all, and we were still there and we could fight. So the PLO was extremely important for people like me. So that by the 1970s, early 1970s, I and some others around me, we started to get active. And remember that in those days, our task was to inform people around us about Palestine, what it was all about, why we were there, why we had been expelled from our homeland. That was our task, because believe it or not, when you live today and you see that at the very least, everybody knows who the Palestinians are. I assure you, in the 1970s, nobody knew who they were. You know, Israel had been very effective in suppressing um, any news or information about Palestinians, and people believed it. They actually thought that Palestinians somehow kind of disappeared, and so really that was it. So we started to get together and started to think, as I say, our task was quite focused. It was to introduce ourselves, our history, our story to the British public and those of my other Palestinians working in the United States, in Europe, were beginning to do the same, depending on the country that they were living in. So that's what did it. But you know, I want to make a major point, a much larger point here. You know, people have got to understand actually that the Israelis didn't just expel us physically. You know, people need to understand that the Israelis tried from then, and they're still doing it today, to wipe out our culture, our history, our presence in the land, leaving aside even our rights or any of that. But actually, we as a people, the Israelis have been working night and day to make us a non-people. Groups of refugees like President Eisenhower might have thought, you know, hanging around here and there, so-called Arab refugees. Nobody knew who they were. That was it. Now, if you think about it, and this is really very important, the idea that this group of these fragmented people still managed to shout out, to say, we're here, this is our story, has led us to this day, by the way. It's led us here. Nobody doesn't know who the Palestinians are. They might not like them, or they might not approve of some of them, but they certainly know who they are. And that was because of the Palestinians, nothing else.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's tremendous to see the power of Palestinian organizing and resilience and just mobilization over the last several decades and also over the last 8 months. Um, kind of moving into today with another quote for us, Benny Morris stated in 2004, an Israeli historian, that if David Ben-Gurion was already engaged in expulsion, maybe he should have done a complete job. I know that this stuns the Arabs and the liberals and the politically correct types, but my feeling is that this place would be quieter and no less suffering if the matter had been resolved once and for all. If Ben-Gurion had carried out a large expulsion and cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel as far as the Jordan River, it may yet turn out that this was his fatal mistake. If he had carried out a full expulsion rather than a partial one, he would have stabilized the state of Israel for generations. So revisiting this statement today in the midst of a constantly escalating genocide in Gaza, as well as constantly escalating violence and horrors in the West Bank, can you tell us more about what you think about Netanyahu's government's actions in Gaza? Is your sense that he's trying to complete the job that Ben-Gurion did not?
Yes, and by the way, I just want to say something at this point. Not, one must guard against trying to make out that Benjamin Netanyahu is the problem. He's not. He is the last in a long line of Israeli leaders who would like to see the Palestinians disappear off the face of the earth. We need to be quite clear about that. Now, the fact that he has expressed this wish so monstrously and so horrifically by killing so many Palestinians in Gaza is just a difference of degree. It's not a difference in kind. Yes, and I think Benny Morris was right. He was right in his in that famous conversation he had on, I think it's Haaretz in 2004, where he did say it's a pity really that Ben Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, didn't complete the job. Because if all the Palestinians had been either killed or expelled, then Israel would have had a much longer period of calm and enjoyment and freedom from conflict. Of course, it's always very good to remember that though it would have bought Israel many more years of calm, the fact is that the Palestinians who were thrown out, just like the Palestinians the smaller proportion of Palestinians, if you like, who were thrown out, they don't forget. They don't forget, and they fight to come home. So how actually it would have worked out in reality, is difficult to predict. But the idea that by expelling all the Palestinians, or by either killing or by killing gets rid of them. But I mean, if you expel them, the idea that this actually means you're going to have a good life is absurd. It's quite obviously absurd. You can see what's happening now.
So in a series of interviews that I was just getting to watch with you, you were talking about liberation for Palestinians and how liberation means regaining Palestine. And I wondered if you could tell us more about your vision for regaining Palestine. What does it look like to you to regain Palestine? How is this possible? How can we move towards this concretely? And are we moving towards this concretely? I guess another, like a sub question of this is that I've heard you say in interviews before that that felt kind of prophetic, that there will be periods of intense suffering before Palestine is liberated, that it will be a long, difficult fight with many casualties on both sides. And I guess it made me wonder, in the context of today, whether you read this as that dark period, whether this is really a massive step in the right direction in terms of regaining Palestine and liberation.
Yes. Now, remember that a lot of that was said or written before October 7th. October 7th has changed very much, has changed the whole situation, turned it upside down, really. Now, strictly speaking, if the Israelis manage to ethnically cleanse what remains of Palestine, then we're talking about quite a different sort of struggle and a different future. My views were predicated on the fact that they would remain, that however brutal Israel was, it would not be able to eradicate them. So they would actually stay. Now, the question then becomes, what happens next? Because the Israelis are quite clearly not thinking seriously about what happens next. Or they're in the grips of partly a war fever and partly some kind of fantasy in which the Palestinians will somehow be made to disappear, either by being killed or by being thrown out. So if we actually have to set that aside, that vision, which is a fantasy, and we really have to deal with reality. In reality, the people who stay behind are the ones about whom one talks in terms of a future. Where is this all going to end? Well, in my view, and I know it's difficult at the moment, we're not talking about tomorrow, but in the long term, in my view, there is only one way that this hideous conflict will end, and that is by the replacement of the current state of Israel with a democratic state, which is a state of the people who live there. That is, the Palestinians who live in the Palestinian areas and the Palestinians who have been expelled, who live currently in refugee camps or who live in exile, people like me and their descendants. These are the Palestinian people. So if one imagines that you have a democratic state in which people have equal citizenship, on the one hand, the Palestinians, and on the other, the Jewish Israelis, they all have equal citizenship and they're citizens of the new state, which is a democratic, secular state. This is the way forward, in my opinion. Actually, it's not an idealized vision, and it isn't about romance, previous enemies now embrace. None of this. It's to do with what is realistic and practical. You cannot eradicate the Palestinians, and you cannot expel the Jewish Israelis back to the West or to the Arab countries where they came from. It can't be done. They are there, and the future needs to include them. And therefore, to me, it was obvious that the fairest and most sensible way to do that is by granting them citizenship alongside with everybody else, irrespective of whether they're Jews or whether they're Palestinian Arabs or anybody else. So that is the long-term vision that I have. But of course, given what's been happening since this October 7th, it's of course impossible to visualize a situation in which these genocidal enemies can be accepted by the Palestinian victims, and somehow all is well. Somehow all will become well. It's not like that. However, an understanding of where the trajectory of this whole business is going, it would be very welcome for people to bear in mind. And that is the sort of, if you like, the end point, the end of the road for this failed experiment, which is what I call the State of Israel. Uh, However, now you made a very interesting point. You said that I had talked about bloodshed and violence and terrible things happening, and was I thinking of including this recent genocide? This is extreme by any standard. I mean, when I was talking like this or writing like this, never could I have imagined that the state of Israel, its army, could actually contemplate something so horrific as this. But even so, things come to an end, and people live to fight another day. And then the question then becomes, where are we headed? What are we going to do? And by the way, it's indicative of the way that the Western powers, which set up Israel and have supported it ever since, have so insultingly condescended to the Palestinians and told them what the solution has to be, which which is apparently this two-state solution, without consulting, without saying, well, look, is this something that would, what do you feel about it? What would be your solution? Even to pay them the respect of saying, what would you like to see? Anyway, there we are.
Yeah, how do you read or contextualize this clinging to the two-state solution as a viable or realistic option by Western leaders and also the Western public? Like, I feel like I hear this from my white liberal family, that the two-state solution is the only solution. And yet I've never heard this from Palestinian communities on the ground in Palestine. It's very clear that that's no longer a possibility because of intentional Israeli state policy to take it off the table. So how do you understand this persistence in clinging to a two-state solution as somehow the only solution put forth by Western leaders?
Yeah, yeah. And no, and it's a very good question. It's a question that needs to be asked, because clearly it can't happen. And it can't happen for very simple reasons. Number one, Israel doesn't want it. So since there are two parties to any solution, and one of the parties doesn't want it, you cannot have a solution like this. So even at its simplest, Israel doesn't want it. Secondly, Israel has done everything it can to stop it happening. We have 700,000 Jewish settlers sitting in what is supposed to be the Palestinian state. Well, who's going to get rid of them? Who is going to get rid of the settlements? There's never any answer to any of this. It's all just this talk about a two-state solution. Now, how do I explain it? First, it's lazy thinking. It's lazy lazy ideology. It's failure to look at the reality of the situation. Secondly, on the face of it, it sounds quite nice. It's the sort of thing that people can say, well, we care about both parties here. So, Israel remains Israel, and now the Palestinians have a bit of their original homeland, and everybody settles down. So there is, as I say, this aspect to it, that it sounds nice and seems to be fair to everybody in this conflict. And thirdly, frankly, back to the laziness, then you don't have to think at all. If you produce this, it's a conversation stopper. You don't then have to answer questions. You don't have to bother yourself to ask yourself, well, where's this going to happen? Even if Israel accepted it, how's Israel going to be made to accept it? How do you get rid of the settlements? How do you free up the territory for the Palestinian state? There's never any answer to that. So I think it's one of those liberal sounding slogans which makes people feel happy. So it makes the Western states, which have created this ghastly problem and continue to support this state, they get to feel a little bit better about themselves, that they're not just simply supporters of Israel. And secondly, it's as I say, it stops you having to do any hard thinking about really how you could solve this crisis in Palestine. So I think that this is what keeps it going.
That's very interesting. I like the lazy read. It makes sense to me. I also wonder about, I mean, you've said that October 7th totally flipped the table on the situation, and that short term it's the table's now flipped. What does one do? And yet long term, the vision that we all need to align behind is one democratic state that's not an apartheid state, in which everybody, irrespective of ethnicity and religion, has civil and human rights.
Mhm.
But I do wonder if you have concrete next steps for us as activists. What should we be really pushing for in order to try to dismantle this genocidal settler colonial state and establish a democratic state in which both Palestinians and Israelis have equal rights?
Right? Yeah. Well, first of all activists and all right-thinking people need to stop the genocidal war. That is the number one aim. Whatever happens, however you solve this, the genocide has to stop. The killing has to stop. So that's what people need to get behind. Demand of their governments that Israel, uh, uh, that they call off the Israeli attack dogs, which is the way I think of them, really. So that's first. Secondly, I think that activists have to get behind sanctions. They have to make it work, to make Israel take notice of anything. It has to be sanctioned. And that is something that activists need to work on their governments to do, on whatever they themselves are able to do in terms of encouraging companies, etc. And there are examples of this. We're not talking about fairy tales. We know that there are, for example, universities, several Western universities have responded to activist sit-ins, student action, student protest by withdrawing investments, divesting from companies that support Israel. This is a very good start. And we've got to go on pressing for that. We must do that. But then you see, that's immediate. But in the long term, activists really do have to adopt the vision of the secular democratic state, because that's what they've been working towards. If you got supposing you got a chastened Israel, let's say, which wasn't quite so dreadful to the Palestinians, had responded to sanctions or whatever by stopping the killing, that doesn't solve the problem in the long term. The problem is the existence of the Israeli state. I'm afraid this is how people have to understand it. It's not just a matter of the odd Israeli government or Benjamin Netanyahu or something like this. It's not. The whole structure, which is based on apartheid, it's based on supremacy, Jewish supremacy. It's got to come. That business has to be dismantled. Of course, when one says that, friends of Israel now start jumping up and down and saying, you want to kill Jews. It's nothing to do with killing Jews. It's to do with dismantling a state structure, which is predicated on certain ideas that are unacceptable in today's world. no supremacy, no apartheid. These are not acceptable, and they have to be removed. And if that means that the state structures that created those has to be dissolved, well, so be it. That's how it has to happen.
Right. People do really lose their minds when one talks about dismantling the state of Israel, because it's so interpreted to mean get rid of all Israelis and Jews in Palestine. And it's so not what we mean. We mean end apartheid. And yet it makes me wonder, how do you perceive more broadly the role of language and discourse in shaping international perspectives on the last 76 years, and particularly in framing the narrative of the Israeli state or undermining the rights of Palestinians?
Yeah, well, look, don't forget, must never forget that all activists are fighting a organized propaganda campaign on behalf of the state of Israel that has been ongoing for decades. It's a very effective campaign. It shaped people's thinking. It's terrifying if you think about it. The way it has made people believe certain things which are simply false, and created sensitivities and anxieties amongst ordinary people or commentators or political thinkers who have learned to be terrified of doing anything against a collective of Jews, which is what Israel it really is, a collective of Jews, just in case it's understood to mean, as you said quite rightly, understood to mean against all Jews because they are Jews. And of course, it's nothing of the sort. So in a way, you see, what one must do is to concentrate on the positive vision. So you say, we are aiming towards a state where people live together in harmony and in equality. That's the thing that has to be stressed. Now, it's quite clear, of course, that that state cannot exist unless the current structure is dismantled. So in your use of language, you have to really concentrate on this positive vision and not dwell on what needs to be done. And if very often, as sometimes when one gives these talks, people say, well, how do you think that's going to happen? Doesn't it mean that, Israelis will have to do this or have to do that? You say, well, it means that the state structure has to change. And for the state structure has to change, it has to replace the structure that is already in existence. The people remain the people, but the structure under which they live has to be changed. And that's all, one just has to say that. And avoid pitfalls, because of course, the first thing that anybody listening to someone putting forward the thesis that I am, first thing they try and do is trip you up, saying, oh, you want to kill Jews, or no, second Holocaust, all this stuff. And you have to be aware of it and resist it. But you're right to point out the question of language. The language has been controlled, I'm sorry, but it's been controlled by the Zionists. For so long, nobody can think straight.
Right, absolutely. And it's particularly poignant, this control or utilization or weaponization of language and of history here in Germany, which I wanted to go back to the student encampments and the successful divestment campaigns that many encampments in the US and in Spain have seen. And here as well, we've been busy trying to escalate with our universities, and we've had pretty extreme repression in response and violence from the police, and silencing and deplatforming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so as someone who's been involved in Palestinian activists on the front lines for at least 50 years and has faced countless experiences of being banned, canceled, ignored, deplatformed, what advice would you offer to us students organizing in the hostile Western world?
Well, look, I think Germany is an extreme example of a phenomenon whereby support for Israel is seen as being crucial and central and essential. In the case of Germany, this is so strongly the case that it's really quite difficult to operate within the parameters of a kind of a thought process like this. It's really very difficult. All I can suggest to people active in Germany, for example, is that they just have to persist. They just have to persist. You cannot give in, while being aware that the state is your enemy and that the police is your enemy. Being aware of that and taking what precautions you can, you cannot stop. You really cannot stop. And that, I think, applies to all activists in Western countries, because Western countries, to a lesser extent, certainly than Germany, are operating within a mental political framework which is set for them by the Zionists. And they believe it, they've swallowed it, and it's very, very disheartening, really. However, despite that, one has to go on. One has to, because in a way, it's really important to stress the point about Palestine and the Palestinians. It's not just a small people somewhere in the Middle East who've been treated badly. It has a moral resonance, which is extremely important. People have to understand that by supporting the Palestinians and their rights, you're actually being true to yourself. You're saying, I have a conscience. I cannot stand by and see this arrant injustice being committed day after day. It diminishes me as a human being. That's the way people have to think about it.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you yourself have persisted in this struggle for the last several decades. How have you maintained your resilience and your sense of hope while working so tirelessly toward Palestinian liberation? And what sustains you and keeps you going? How do you take care of yourself?
Well, look, it's not been easy. But in my case, I don't think I had a choice. I can't, because to be Palestinian is to be the product of that system of criminal injustice. And you cannot, nobody can forget, pretend that it doesn't matter or that it's not happening. Now, I can really understand what I would call burnout. And I have had feelings like that myself, where I've thought, let others carry on the fight. I can't, I'm too tired. But it doesn't last for long, because I'm animated by a sense of injustice, and it's not fair. And at a very simple level, I tell you the truth, I want to die in my country. I don't want to be buried, as the British poet says, in some corner of a foreign field. I really don't. And okay, a lovely cat. So I don't want that. And why should I? Why should I have to put up with a fate like that? So that's, I think, the answer to the question. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I did want to open it up to everybody to ask all of your questions. If folks have questions, we have a couple initial questions that we've already collected from the rest of our big coalition for you, but I wonder if folks who are in the call right now have questions that are burning. And if not, perhaps we can start it off with these questions from the broader coalition. In 1972, you established Palestine Action to counteract the negative perception of Palestinians held by the British public at the time. This was before the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, had any representatives in Britain, and before Yasser Arafat's historic appearance at the UN General Assembly in 1974. Could you share your experience organizing in London during that period? What strategies did you use to raise awareness and convince the Western public about the Palestinian issue?
Yeah, look, it was a tiny group of us, really, just 4 or 5 friends. And because the field was wide open, don't forget that since Palestinians had somehow disappeared from the public scene and nobody talked about Palestine and things like that. In a way, we could let our imaginations roam and we were not scared of anything. We tried everything. So actually, we had quite a few successes, um, which maybe, we wouldn't have done a bit later on. But it was so unusual for people before they realized what the hell was going on. They'd already, done it. So we wrote to the foreign secretary in this country. We asked for an appointment to see him. We did stuff like that. We picketed. We stood around in pickets of various meetings, organizations, government buildings. We did all that. And I think really the most daring thing we ever did was to write to the Queen of England, to the British Queen. Now, what we did is I organized this with a few others. We organized a slow, mournful walk to the cenotaph in London, which is evocative of the people who died in the world wars. We said we wanted to commemorate our dead who had died in our country. And I don't think the police really understood a thing about it. I think they thought we were just a group of women who wanted to do something like this. And why not? And they couldn't see any problem. So they gave us permission. Anyway, we all dressed in black. It was quite dramatic. And we walked slowly down towards the cenotaph and laid a wreath on the tomb, on the unknown, the tomb of the unknown soldier. And then the police cottoned on and were really furious. I remember furious. They said, "How dare you? We thought there was just a few of you going down to the cenotaph. This is a demonstration," whatever. Anyway, we were undeterred. And another person with me, we went to Buckingham Palace with our letter to the Queen. And we wrote her to say, "You as a mother will understand our feelings as..." Now, a lot of us were quite young and absolutely had no children of our own or any of that, but she wasn't to know that. So we wrote and said, "We are grieving women, grieving mothers, and you as a mother will surely understand whatever." And we delivered it to Buckingham Palace. We were referred to a side entrance, and we handed the letter to somebody who came out, and we got a response from the Queen. She wrote and said, it was not she, somebody in the palace wrote saying, I remember the words, "I am commanded by Her Majesty, to write in response to your letter. She is indeed moved by the sufferings of people everywhere," or something, quite bland. And but still, we got a response. And so anyway, it was things like that. I explain it, as I say, on the basis that there was only us. Nobody else was doing this kind of thing. And, we were sort of non-threatening, and we sort of were young and etc. But then in 1974, the first PLO representative was assigned to London. And then we felt less lonely, less on our own.
I love that story. You really were renegades. Very badass. Farina says, "Dear Dr. Karmi, thank you so much for your heartening conversation. I'm curious to hear from someone who has been in this fight for so long. How do you see this current wave of global support for Palestine? How does it feel to watch a movement so massively standing up for Palestine?
Thank you for that question. The answer is I'm really exhilarated by it. What can I tell you? You know, for years and years, we fought this lonely fight, um, always against odds, against trying to change people's minds. And to be fair, we did, the Palestine cause did get a certain amount of support, there's no doubt, but nothing like this. It really exhilarated me and people like me. We felt at last, the world has taken notice. And I can only hope and pray that that solidarity will translate into political action, into an influence on opinion formers in those countries, because that's really the measure. That's what we want. So the wave of popular sympathy and support is heartening. It's lovely. It's wonderful, but it must translate into meaningful political action to support the Palestinians.
Kind of in this same vein, this is a question from one of our fellow students, Lucho. Among one of the demands of our two encampments that we launched, one at the FU and one at the HAU, one of our demands was to recognize Palestinian statehood and ensure that all Palestinian students are recognized as Palestinians in universities' official registries. And this demand was formulated because a German university sent an email to Palestinian students to inform them that they would be recognized no longer as Palestinians, but as stateless. How do you evaluate the recognition of Palestinian statehood that so many countries are taking as a measure right now? Do you think this recognition operates in favor or against the one state solution that you envision long term?
Yeah, very good question again. Yes, because you know you'd have to on the one hand, the idea of a recognition of a Palestinian state begs the question: a Palestinian state where? Now, of course, the implicit understanding that is operating here is that we're talking about the two-state solution again, so that the Palestinian state would be in the 1967 territories. That's the implicit understanding. However, the way I like to see it is it's welcome because the principle of Palestinian statehood is what matters. The principle, the idea that Palestinians are entitled to have a state. The principle is good, it's welcome, and needs to be supported. Where the state is, what its boundaries are, is for another discussion. For me, it's enough, or I'd like to interpret the recognition of a Palestinian state as meaning a recognition of Palestinian statehood. And indeed, some states, you know, have talked about self-determination. They have, but the bits that they don't go on to say, they omit, are, you know, it's alongside Israel or stuff like this. So, you know, in a way, I think it's welcome. I don't mind, because if you like, it's never going to happen, because the Palestinian state that's on the 67 territories is never going to happen. But the principle that the Palestinians have a right to a state is what really matters.
Mm-hmm. Right. So establishing the right and then pushing for that right to turn into one democratic state with.
Absolutely. The fact that, you know, if you say Palestinians have a right to a state, then the next question would be, what sort of state? And the answer to that would be a democratic state, in which whoever inhabits the land of Palestine becomes a citizen. So those are the steps in reasoning that you have. But of course, don't forget that a lot of these recognitions by particularly Western states of Palestinian statehood is a way of avoiding the thing they're all terrified of, which is confronting Israel. You see, it's more, it's simpler, it's more comfortable if you recognize a Palestinian state than if you take head on the state of Israel and you say, for example, you don't deserve to be a state. Your statehood, the right should be withdrawn from you. Because actually, if you think about that, the state of Israel was created by the UN General Assembly in 1949 by a majority of states that voted for it. Well, it makes perfect sense to me to say you, Israel, have behaved so badly, you have so breached the UN Charter, you don't deserve to be a state. We withdraw our recognition of you as a member state of the UN. That's what actually should be happening. But of course, they're too scared to say that. Therefore, they opt for the easier course, which feels good, and everybody is very happy about that, and thanks them and so on, which is to recognize Palestinian statehood, thus dodging, in my view, the real questions around this.
That's a very compelling course of action.
Yeah, I wish more people would sort of think about it because, if you, it's much more effective to disqualify the state of Israel and isolate it even further than to, say, oh, we like Palestinians and we're going to be nice to them.
Right.
Mm.
And to disqualify it on such valid grounds.
Yeah, totally. Because actually, all you've got to do is look up the UN Charter. Now, states that become members have to, they sign on to abide by the UN Charter. Those are the conditions of membership. Israel has flouted those repeatedly, violently, savagely. Other member states have every right to say, you have forfeited your right to be a member state of this body. You don't subscribe to its rules. You don't abide by anything it has decided. Therefore, you're not a member. And actually, if you think about it, take any club, really, it has membership rules. So if just taking it at the individual level, a member joins and signs the thing which says, I abide by the rules of this club, and then that member starts bashing about and crashing the club and shooting other members, clearly it no longer, it has to be thrown out, it's expelled, you see. If only, it would be very, very effective if there were a motion for the expulsion of the state of Israel from the United Nations, really. This is what I think quite seriously needs to be thought about.
I wondered also about a statement that you made in a talk about 5 years ago at the Oxford Union, in which you said that the Arab world has not failed the Palestinian people. And you said this, of course, in the context of the Arab world being frequently blamed for failing the Palestinian people, for not adequately integrating refugees and supporting more than 750,000 Palestinians who were pushed out in the 1948 beginning of the ongoing Nakba. And you were reframing this allegation to clarify that, of course, the problem that was created in Palestine was not the fault of the Arab world. It originated with the creation of the State of Israel and Israel's subsequent policies that continued to oppress Palestinians. And so it didn't make sense to blame the Arab nations for their failure when it was in fact not their mess. But it did make me wonder about today, in the current context, after the last several years of normalization after normalization, and now after the last 8 months of genocide, during which really only Yemen has taken bold action against Israeli genocide, do you still feel that the Arab world has not failed the Palestinian people?
No, I don't feel that anymore, because the situation that I described was the situation as it was in 1948-49, where Arab states many of them had attained their own independence only recently. They were themselves, as it were, states in formation. So no, it's not the same now. The fact of the matter is that um, Arab official now, I want to make it very clear that we're talking about the actions of Arab governments. We're not talking about Arab populations. In contrast to their populations, Arab states have displayed enormous cowardice in the face of this genocidal war. They have been paralyzed. They have remained silent. Um, in terms of effective action, I mean, in order to isolate Israel, they have failed even to break off diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. This is a terrible situation. It's extremely depressing. Now, of course, there are explanations, not least their dependence on the United States. It's not so much any kind of love of Israel. It's much more their really abject dependence on United States favor, United States protection. So it's very sad, but that's the reality, and people have to understand there are reasons for why people do what they do. It's not that these Arab leaders say, "Oh, we hate Palestinians, we're going to be beastly to them." It's not like that. They are terrified themselves, and they see that the United States will support Israel through thick and thin, and that must be a very scary lesson for them. So, punishing them is small fry in comparison to how the US has supported Israel with arms and diplomacy and funding. It's quite extraordinary. So, I mean, yes, no, that is what I would say. It's comment on how really how unfortunate, how broken the Arab system is. Really, it's shown up all this, and of course, people have to understand. December, I don't know why I keep saying December. October the 7th. It's another illustration of the way that October 7th has upended everything. It's unmasked everybody as well. It's made nobody can now hide. The Western states' partiality for Israel has been exposed. Their hypocrisy in so-called adhering to international law has been exposed as a fraud. The United States support for Israel, which is apparently open-ended, has been exposed. Arab failure has been exposed. The failure of the Islamic states, which we mustn't forget about, has also been exposed. So really, this has been a time of reckoning. And I think the most important thing that should come out of October 7th is the reckoning I'm talking about, where different actors need to have a reckoning with themselves as to what they're really doing.
Right, absolutely. Sarah asks, and this perhaps will be our final question, so we can let you go after so much of our questioning. Your idea about withdrawing recognition of Israel from the UN invokes the idea that other members of the UN who have also engaged in atrocities, attacks, and violations against other states and communities. What would you say to that? This idea is manifested now in the outrage of the US about the ICC order against Netanyahu, thinking that American leaders will be next.
Yeah, that's a very, very pertinent question. Yes, Israel will not be the only member state that behaves in illegitimate ways and breaks the law. And maybe, yes, maybe the time has come to get rid of these lawbreakers who simply operate on a basis of might is right, and who actually pay lip service to all this business about international law. Maybe that's another effect of October 7th, exposing the fraud that is international law. And I don't mean that its principles are wrong. I mean the way it's practiced, the way it's adhered to. It's not adhered to. That needs to be, that's been exposed. And therefore, what does this all mean? Don't we have to start again? These are really important and fundamental questions, which I suggest are now being asked. It is now possible to ask these questions after October 7th, and which were disguised and masked and hidden before.
Yes, lots to do. It's kind of an exciting note to end on. I just really wanted to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here with us today. Even though we just had your voice and all of your thoughts and all of your expertise, it has been so, inspiring and heartwarming, and just a lovely conversation. So thank you so much.
No, and thank you for giving me the option. I really, really regret the fact that you couldn't see me. But however, I'm very happy about the opportunity to talk to your group, let's hope maybe another time things will work out in the technical department of my computer.
Well, we would absolutely love that if technical difficulties just led to us having another opportunity to chat with you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Night, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here with us, and we hope to see you at our next lecture.